What unexplained memories do you have from your childhood? Story 1. I have a story that was a mystery until just a few years ago. When I was 5, I had a big bay window that faced our backyard. One night, I was sitting in bed with the curtains open, reading, when I suddenly heard a loud thump on the window. I looked up and saw what I thought was a zombie pressed against the glass, staring at me with foggy eyes. I froze in terror, completely unsure of what to do. I was the kind of kid who never had nightmares and wasn't afraid of the dark. I knew monsters weren't real, but there one was, slowly sliding down the window. Screaming, I ran out of the room, practically babbling in fear to my grandparents. After they calmed me down and got me to explain what happened, they took me outside to show me there was nothing there. That might have been the end of it. Except when I woke up the next morning, I noticed a greasy smear on the window and some weird little pieces of what looked like flesh under the window. When I pointed it out to my grandparents, they brushed it off, saying maybe a bird had hit the window. That was the end of the conversation. But for years after, I was terrified of the dark. I needed nightlights everywhere and was so scared that I even wet the bed a couple of times because I was too afraid to walk down the dark hallway to the bathroom. This remained an unexplained mystery for almost 20 years until a couple of Thanksgivings ago, when my family was swapping stories about weird things that had happened to us. I told my zombie window story, and my uncle started laughing so hard he could barely breathe. When he finally caught his breath, he explained what had actually happened. At the time, my uncle was living in the house next door to us. He had a friend who worked in special effects for movies, and she had been working on makeup for a floating corpse effect. That night, my uncle had come home with the makeup still on, planning to show it to his wife. As he cut through our backyard, he noticed me sitting in bed and thought it would be hilarious to slam against the window to scare me. Then he went home and completely forgot about it for years, leaving me to deal with the trauma. Thanks, Uncle. Story 2. When I was about 6 or 7, I lived in a different house. One night, my mom tucked me into bed like normal. But when I woke up, I found myself in a very tight, dark space. It was pitch black, and I felt cramped. I started screaming for help. After what felt like 5 minutes of yelling and crying, something jerked the space I was in, and I heard a zipping noise. That's when I saw my dad's face. I was inside a suitcase. Somehow, I had ended up inside a suitcase that was under the guest room bed, and no one knows how. It wasn't a dream or anything because my family still talks about it sometimes. To this day, I have no idea how I ended up in there. Story 3. When I was a kid, I was a terrible sleeper. I would wake up scared all the time and call for my mom, usually asking her for a glass of water. Even though it must have been annoying, my mom never did more than let out a big sigh and remind me during the day to try and go back to sleep on my own. One night, I woke up scared as usual, called my mom, and asked for water. While waiting, my mom came back into the room, but this time she looked really upset and she didn't have the glass of water. She fussed at me, telling me to stop being such a baby and to go back to sleep. Then she abruptly left the room. Not even a minute later, my mom came back in, this time with a glass of water and wearing a different nightgown. She laid down next to me and told me everything was okay. I asked her about what happened earlier, and she told me she hadn't been in the room before that. I was a little scared of her the next day, and I still have no idea what happened that night. Story 4. When I was young, I had this vague memory of being in a Middle Eastern-looking country in someone's house, and my mom was trying on a sari, but the memory was tinged with fear. Decades later, shortly before he passed away, I asked my father about it. He told me the full story. Around 1968, we had traveled to Tunisia, and my mom, being outgoing, had struck up a conversation with someone. We ended up being invited to a rich person's house for dinner. Everything played out just like I remembered. But what neither my dad nor I knew at the time was that the host had been running his foot up and down my mother's leg under the table throughout the dinner. My mom, who was incredibly smart and quick on her feet, didn't react because she knew my father had a temper, and things could have escalated very badly. As my dad said, this was Tunisia in the 60s. If a few tourists had disappeared or turned up dead, nothing would have happened. My mom totally handled the situation like a pro. I miss her every day. Story 5. This is actually my boyfriend's story, and it's something that still haunts him. When he was about 4 or 5, he woke up in his bedroom, but had no idea who he was or where he was. His mind was completely blank. He couldn't remember anything. He sat there confused for a while before walking out into the hallway. He saw his mom and asked her if she was his mom. She laughed and said yes, thinking he was just being silly. He then saw a man outside by the mailbox, assumed it was his dad, and ran out to ask him if he was his father. His dad said yes, but my boyfriend still couldn't remember anything. He asked his dad what his name was, and his dad told him, but it didn't spark any memories. He spent the rest of the day scared and sad, eventually getting used to things. But he still vividly remembers that day and is terrified that something bad happened just before, and he somehow repressed the memories. Story 6. My father passed away when I was 3 years old. I vividly remember walking into the room where he had died and seeing his face, which had turned purple. I remember noticing some chicken soup dribbling down the side of his mouth, as my mom had been trying to get him to eat. I remember feeling confused but not crying. Afterward, I just walked back to my room and watched Power Rangers. To this day, my mother swears that she had a neighbor take me to their house as soon as my father began to pass away, and that I never saw him like that. My siblings also confirm this, saying the room was locked by the time I came back. Yet the memory is so vivid and no one ever described what he looked like when he passed. I have no idea where that memory came from. Story 7. Between the ages of 7 and 10, I used to have frequent nightmares and would often go into my parents' room to ask if I could sleep with them. I always went to my mom's side because I didn't want to wake up my dad, who had to wake up early for work. One night, after a nightmare, I remember standing by my mom's side of the bed and nudging her gently for what felt like 30 minutes. The clock read a little after midnight. I kept whispering to her, trying to wake her up, but she didn't move. Then I looked at the clock again, and it was 3:12 a.m. I was so confused that all my fear from the nightmare disappeared, and I just went back to my room and fell asleep. Story 8. When I was around 12, my dad came into my room with an issue of Sports Illustrated swimsuit edition. He sat on my bed and asked for my opinion on a few of the models. When I didn't seem interested, which naturally I wasn't because it felt strange, he left the magazine on my bed and told me I could look through it when I wanted to. I left the magazine untouched out of fear it might be some sort of trap or test. A few hours later, my mom found it. She asked me where I got it, and I told her, "Dad left it here." Confused, she stormed off to confront him, and I overheard them having an hour-long argument. I remember her asking him why he thought I needed the magazine, and he responded, "I don't want him getting weird ideas about stuff." Years later, I realized that my dad thought I might be gay, and this was his way of testing the theory. These days, he's completely accepting of gay people. But back then, he was clearly a little uncomfortable with the idea of his son possibly being gay. Funny thing is, I'm straight, but joke's on them. I ended up sneaking into their room to find that magazine all the time after that. Story 9. In 7th grade, we had to do research projects on U.S. presidents. I picked John Tyler. The day we were supposed to present, the teacher randomly called on students. As I waited anxiously for my turn, I realized I was one of the last ones left. After the final presentation, the teacher stood up and said, "Good job, everyone." I stood up and said, "Excuse me, Mr. Wilson, you forgot me." He looked at me, confused, and replied, "No, you already presented on John Tyler." I was completely baffled. I looked around the room for someone to back me up, but my classmates just nodded in agreement, saying I had already presented. Confused and feeling a bit crazy, I sat down. To this day, I still don't understand what happened. Story 10. When I was about 6, I hurt my cheek and iced it with one of those gel ice packs. For some reason, I started chewing on it, and the plastic broke, causing a little of the liquid to leak into my mouth. I looked at the package and saw a huge "Do not eat" warning. I immediately panicked, convinced I was going to die. But instead of crying or telling my parents, I calmly went upstairs, cleaned my room, combed my hair, and put on my best pajamas. I went to each family member, told them I loved them, and then went to my room, crossed my arms over my chest like in the movies, and waited to die. When I woke up the next morning, I was incredibly relieved. Looking back, I still can't believe how calmly I accepted what I thought was my impending death. Story 11. When I was about 8, I was out walking my dog near my old house and stumbled upon a small crop circle in the middle of a field. It was made up of 3 perfect circles, each about 3 feet wide, placed at the points of an equilateral triangle. I was freaked out and told my dad, who brushed it off and said the lawn mowing company probably did it. To calm me down, he even showed me a sword he kept hidden in his gun closet and said he'd use it if any aliens showed up. That satisfied me at the time. Years later, I realized that no one ever mowed that field, so why would the lawn company have been out there? Story 12. I was maybe 3 or 4 years old. My family was at my mom's coworker's house for a get-together, and I was playing hide-and-seek with their daughter, who was my friend. We decided to hide in one of the cars in the driveway without telling anyone. Eventually, we got bored and started exploring the car. My friend found some nail polish. It was actually whiteout, and we started painting our nails with it. About 10 minutes later, our moms found us, both of them in tears. I didn't understand why they were so upset until years later, when my mom told me that we had been sitting in a car that had a loaded gun in the glove compartment, a compartment we hadn't opened. That car's owner, who became like a grandfather to me, never cleaned up the whiteout mess we made on the dash. He kept it as a reminder to always lock up his gun. The memory sticks with me because I vividly remember the terror on my mom's face. Story 13. When I was 7 or 8, there was a creek in the forest behind my house where I played all the time. One side of the creek had a dirt wall about 5 feet high. I loved jumping over the creek from one side to the other, pretending I was some kind of parkour expert. One day, I went out there and found a football lying in the middle of the creek. It hadn't just rolled in, it was placed there. The water wasn't deep enough to cover it, and the top half of the football was completely dry. Written on it in permanent marker were the words, "My first name jumps," along with a phone number. Naturally, I was freaked out. I took the football home and called the number, only to discover it was the number for Homeland Security. Yeah, that Homeland Security. I tried explaining what happened to the woman on the phone, but she told me to never call that number again. I told my mom, and she was just as confused as I was. Later that evening, I gave the football to my dad and asked him to look into it. For days after, I kept asking him what he found out, but he would either dodge the question or give vague answers. Eventually, he started acting like he didn't even remember the football at all. To this day, I have no idea who placed that football in the creek, why my name was written on it, or why the phone number was for Homeland Security. My mom remembers it vaguely, but my dad insists he doesn't remember anything about it. Story 14. I have this strange memory of waking up at night when I was a kid and seeing these weird figures standing around my bed. Some of them were cartoon characters from shows I watched, which made me think I was dreaming. But I pinched myself, felt the carpet with my toe, and realized I was awake. For a moment, I thought about getting out of bed, but I had this sudden gut feeling telling me to stay still and go back to sleep. Years later, I watched a documentary about paranormal experiences, and an abductee mentioned that aliens sometimes take on familiar forms like cartoon characters to make their presence feel less threatening. Now I wonder what I really saw that night. Story 15. When I was around 3 or 4, my dad, my brother, and I were watching a scary movie late at night. I was hiding behind my dad's back, peeking out at certain scenes. The one I remember most was of a woman in a white room with an open cup of chocolate pudding on the table. She dipped her pinky into the pudding and ate it. After that, my memory goes blank, and the next thing I remember is the woman turning into an alien in a room that looked like the inside of a pumpkin. I've never been able to find that movie, but that scene has stuck with me ever since. Story 16. This is a story that has haunted me since 7th grade. We were moving to a new town, and I was cleaning out the mudroom in our old house. The mudroom had a huge firewood box, and the room next door was often rented out to some working hippie kids in their late 20s. As I was clearing out the area, I found something strange behind the firewood box. A small, flesh-colored bundle with black, beady eyes. At the time, I thought it was some kind of weird animal that had snuck in from the mountains. I threw it in the trash with the rest of the scrap firewood, not thinking much of it. But later that year, after taking sex ed, I had a disturbing realization. What I had seen wasn't an animal, it was a fetus. To this day, I still wonder what on earth happened and how I ended up finding something so eerie. Story 17. This story takes place when I was around 8 or 9 years old. One night I woke up abruptly around 3 a.m. I was readjusting my blankets when something caught my eye. The light coming from the hallway was different than usual. It was normally a yellowish tint from the light fixture, but tonight it was a pure white. Half asleep but curious, I sat up in bed. That's when I heard a voice say, "Don't move." Suddenly I was wide awake and confused. I couldn't figure out what was happening. I decided to test it by moving again, and the voice came back, more stern this time. "Don't move." At this point I was freaking out. I knew my dad was the only other male in the house, but the voice didn't sound like him. I was too scared to move and lay frozen in my bed for what felt like hours. I finally decided to move once more, and this time the voice yelled, "Don't move." I was so terrified that I wet the bed. I stayed perfectly still until I finally fell back asleep around 5 a.m. When I woke up, still damp and in the same position, I ran to tell my parents. They were so disturbed by what I told them that they contacted our church for help. I didn't sleep in that room for the next 2 weeks. Story 18. When I was about 10 years old, my family lived in a really old house in Springfield, Illinois. The previous owner, an elderly woman, had passed away in one of the downstairs rooms. That room eventually became my stepfather's office. One day I was on the computer in the office when I got up to use the bathroom. As soon as I left the room, the door slammed shut behind me, and I heard loud shaking coming from inside. I panicked and ran to grab my mom. She rushed to open the door, thinking someone might be inside, but the door wouldn't budge. We ran outside to look through the window. The room was completely empty, and the window was still locked from the inside. What made it stranger was that a huge bookshelf that weighed at least 1,000 pounds had been moved 6 feet across the room, blocking the door. No books had fallen off, and it would have taken multiple people to move it. My mom was convinced it was the ghost of the previous owner. I'm not sure what I believe, but it was one of the strangest things that ever happened to me. That wasn't the only odd occurrence either. We once saw smoke pouring out of the basement that smelled like church incense, but there was no sign of anything that could have caused it. Story 19. As a kid, I kept hamsters and I loved them. I took good care of them, making sure they were fed and their cage was cleaned regularly. But one of my hamsters was particularly mean and territorial. It terrorized the other hamsters, and one by one, they all died. I seem to remember that they died in pretty gruesome ways, often from infected bites caused by the aggressive hamster. However, my parents reassured me that the hamsters had passed away peacefully and felt no pain. I've always wondered if they told me that just to make me feel better. Over time, my memory has become muddled, and now I'm not sure whether my memories of their violent deaths are real or just nightmares. Story 20. I have a strange memory from my childhood. Whenever I drank apple juice, I would hear voices. It wasn't like regular hearing. It was more like snippets of far-off conversations. As a kid, I convinced myself that I was somehow hearing people from across the world. I even asked my mom if it was possible. On one vacation, I was playing with some old toys at a family member's house. There was one toy that really stood out. It had an odd face that seemed to change every time I looked at it. I distinctly remember seeing it move right in front of my face. It was like watching something morph, as if I was seeing it in a dream or on some kind of hallucinogen. That night, I had a vivid dream about being in a room at the top of the stairs, a room that didn't exist in real life. In the dream, I was standing at the top of the stairs, watching as the toy walked up toward me. None of this scared me at the time, but as I got older, I started to feel uneasy about the memory. There was also one night when I was around 6 or 7 years old. I woke up in the middle of the night, sweating, with every light in my room turned on. I had no idea why. I turned the lights off and went back to bed. When I asked my parents about it the next day, they said I was probably sleepwalking, but I had never sleepwalked before and haven't done so since. Story 21. When I was a child, my parents had friends with a daughter who was about 2 years older than me. Our families went on holiday together a couple of times, and this girl had a small piece of cloth that she claimed was given to her by a ghost in the middle of the night. The ghost, according to her, looked just like her, but with a different hairstyle. I didn't question this at all and completely believed her. One particular memory stands out. I must have been about 4 or 5 years old, and we were on a road trip to Devon. I was sitting in the back of my mom's car with the girl, and our moms were in the front seats. The girl turned to me and said, "Watch this," as she wrapped a hair clip in the cloth. When I wrapped this cloth around something, it moved somewhere else, but never very far away. She unwrapped the cloth, and the hair clip was gone. I was amazed. We searched the back of the car, and I eventually found the hair clip attached to my seatbelt above my shoulder. I was in awe of her magic. Next, she took my toy car, a small green Ford Escort model, and wrapped it in the cloth. This time, when she unwrapped it, the car was gone, but we couldn't find it anywhere. After searching for a while, we gave up. About an hour later, the girl's mom turned around and handed me my toy car, saying she had found it in the glove compartment. I was thrilled and told my mom and her friend about the magic trick. But my mom insisted that the car had been in the glove compartment the whole time, and I cried because I was so sure it had been magically transported. Looking back, I wonder if it was all just a trick that the girl and her mom played on me. or if there was something more to that mysterious cloth. Story 22. This is probably my earliest memory, and it's strange because I was less than a year old at the time. I vividly remember my great-grandpa, who passed away when I was still a baby, holding me while sitting on the couch. What makes the memory even stranger is that when I recall it, I see it from the perspective of someone walking toward us rather than from my own viewpoint. There was a distinctive blue pillow on the couch that my grandparents still have to this day, so I know this memory is at least somewhat plausible. But the fact that I can remember the moment from a perspective I couldn't have had as a baby has always baffled me. It makes me wonder if this is one of those weird false memories our minds create, perhaps from a dream or a photo I saw later on. Story 23. I've always had a strong memory, even for events, from when I was very young. I remember things that happened when I was just 3 years old. One memory in particular stands out from when I was 5. My family was building a house in a new town, so we were staying with my grandparents during the transition. One night, I woke up in the middle of the night to use the bathroom. The bathroom was directly across the hall from the bedroom I shared with my baby brother. As I got to the foot of the bed and went to put my feet on the floor, something, or some kind of force, pushed me back onto the bed with a surprising amount of strength. I was terrified and thought maybe my dad was playing a prank on me. I called out for my dad and my grandfather, but no one answered. Too scared to move, I stayed in bed until morning. To this day, I have no idea what happened that night, but it still spooks me whenever I think about it. Story 24. When I was in the 5th grade, my teacher once asked me to take a slip of paper to the teacher's lounge and hand it to one of the staff members. I assumed it was something routine, but out of curiosity, I unfolded the paper on the way and saw that it said, "Keep him there for 15 minutes. My stomach dropped, but I carried on and gave the note to the staff member in the lounge. She spent the next 15 minutes fumbling around, pretending to look for something before finally handing me a random stack of papers to take back to my teacher. When I returned to the classroom, everyone was looking at me strangely. I had no idea what had happened during the time I was gone, but I knew it involved me somehow. A few days later, I asked a friend what had gone on, but he dodged the question. I was left feeling paranoid and confused. To this day, I have no idea why my teacher wanted to keep me out of the room for those 15 minutes. It's one of those things that still lingers in the back of my mind, even though I've accepted that I'll probably never find out the truth. Story 25. When I was in elementary school, I used to come home to an empty house since my parents wouldn't get back until an hour or two later. During this time, I started doing something strange. I would sit down, close my eyes, and trip into these vivid, elated experiences. It happened so often that I eventually developed a method for it. I would sit in my rocking chair and let it naturally sway while I relaxed completely. I'd stare into the darkness behind my eyelids until I saw small, bubbling spots. If I kept myself from thinking too much, these spots would form into a kind of portal or wormhole that I would go through. For the next few minutes or hours, I wasn't sure, I would drift through these intricate patterns in a blissful state. The moment I became aware of what was happening, I would snap out of it. Once my mom came home to find me sitting in the chair, completely zoned out. She asked what I was doing, but I just brushed it off, telling her I had been taking a nap. Story 26. This happened in 1990 when I was 5 years old, playing Super Mario Bros. With my brothers at my dad's house. Out of nowhere, I suddenly said, "There was just a car accident." My dad, thinking I was imagining things, replied, "No, there wasn't. You must have been imagining." But I was persistent, insisting that something had happened. To humor me, my dad said we should go check. We all went outside, and there was no accident in front of the house. My dad, a little amused, said, "See, no accident." But I pointed down the road and insisted it was around the corner. We started walking, and sure enough, a block away, there had been a serious car accident. A young man speeding down the road had collided with a car pulling out of a driveway. Both vehicles were completely mangled. To this day, the four of us still talk about this incident, and none of us can explain how I knew about the accident without any way to see or hear it. There were no windows facing the street, and we were in a basement suite. It's still a mystery. Story 27. When I was around 5 or 6, my mom and I made a fairy house out of sticks, moss, and tiny pine cones. It was like a little dollhouse that we placed in the woods near our home, right inside a fairy circle of mushrooms. My mom told me that, because we made the house for the fairies and not for ourselves, they might leave me gifts. And they did. Every few days, I'd find sea glass, a golden seashell, or small knickknacks in the fairy house. My mom would space out the gifts to keep the magic alive, and I'd excitedly check every day to see what the fairies had left. Eventually, nature took over, and the fairy house started to break down. But one last visit sticks out in my memory. On that final visit, I saw something tiny shoot up into the sky, trailing sparks and glitter like pixie dust. Inside the house, I found a crystal. I rushed inside to show my mom, but she looked genuinely puzzled and told me she had no idea where the crystal came from. To this day, it remains a mystery. It's a story 28. This happened on a military base when I was about 5 or 6. My mom told me to sit on a bench in the PX shopping center while she looked at clothes. I wasn't allowed to follow her because I had a habit of wandering between the clothing racks and scaring shoppers, so there I sat, bored out of my mind. After a few minutes, a girl, around 9 or 10, sat down next to me. She had tan skin, brown eyes, and long black hair. As soon as she sat down, I heard a strange gurgling noise coming from nowhere in particular. It was unsettling. I glanced over at her, but she was staring at me with a strange intensity, like I was the most interesting thing in the world. Suddenly, I heard a deep mechanical voice say, "Hey, little boy, how are you?" The girl's mouth didn't move, but it felt like the words were coming from her. I was about to ask her how she could talk like a ventriloquist when the voice spoke again. "Hey, little boy, do you want to play?" At that moment, I felt a deep, primal fear, like something wasn't right. I tensed up and slowly turned away, but curiosity got the better of me. I glanced back to see if she had some kind of speech device, but there was nothing. Again, the voice said, "Hey, little boy, do you want to play?" Her smile was warm, but something about it felt wrong. I felt like I was in danger, so I quickly got up and speed walked over to my mom. When she asked why I wasn't sitting on the bench, I casually said, "That girl was annoying me," even though moments before I had been terrified. My fear had inexplicably turned into mild irritation, and I stayed close to my mom for the rest of the shopping trip. Story 29. When I was a kid, maybe 7 or 8, I remember sitting at a desk to read a book when something strange happened. My thoughts suddenly began speeding up, like an uncontrollable rush of rapid, connected ideas, one after the other. It felt like my mind was racing, but in a way I couldn't explain or control. Time seemed to disappear, and I was completely lost in the experience. It happened twice during my childhood, and I still can't fully describe it. The closest comparison I can make, years later, is the feeling of taking hallucinogens like shrooms. It felt otherworldly, both unpleasant and oddly fascinating at the same time. I genuinely thought I was time traveling or experiencing some altered state of consciousness. I've never been able to explain it. Story 30. When I was 4, something strange happened one night. I was lying in bed when the light in my closet suddenly turned on. My bed was on the same wall as the closet, and to turn the closet light on, you had to flip the switch inside of it. I should have been scared, but instead, I felt completely calm. The door slowly opened, and a beautiful woman with brown curly hair and freckles stepped out. She was dressed in white and moved quickly to my bedside. She told me she was an angel sent to watch over me. I wasn't afraid. I asked why she was here, and she thanked me for being hospitable, referring to the sleeping bag and dinosaur pillow I had laid out beside my bed. She told me to go to sleep, and I did. The next morning, I woke up to find the sleeping bag neatly folded and the pillow placed on top. When I asked my parents if they had come into my room, they said no. My dad had been up late watching TV, and my mom had been on the phone all night. I still remember every detail of that night, and it's always puzzled me why I felt so calm and remember it so vividly. Story 31. When I was a kid, I was absolutely fascinated by shiny objects, like fake gems, gold chocolate coins, and cool Pokemon cards. During one book fair, I saw a purple gem-shaped eraser that fit on the top of a pencil, and I wanted it so badly. But it cost $3, and I knew I shouldn't use my lunch money to buy it. Later, as we walked back to the classroom, I saw the exact same eraser lying on the floor in the hallway. Without thinking, I pocketed it. A little while later, a girl in my class started crying because she had lost her eraser, the very one I had just picked up. Feeling terrible, I decided to return it. I went outside, thought it over, and finally walked back inside to hand it to her. She thanked me, and I went back outside to cry because I had really wanted that eraser. When I looked back into the classroom, she was holding the eraser with such joy on her face that it made me feel even worse. Then something strange happened. I reached into my pocket and found the same eraser. Same color, same shape, same gem-like look. I was shocked. I checked again to see if she still had her eraser, and she did. Somehow I had an identical one in my pocket. To this day, I have no idea how the eraser duplicated itself, but that moment has stuck with me as a reminder to treat people with kindness. Story 32. I grew up in Hawaii in the late 70s and 80s, but after graduation, I moved to the Midwest for college. Being far from home, I got homesick a lot, so I would watch shows like Magnum P.I. and Hawaii Five-0 to feel closer to home. One day during my sophomore year, I was watching Hawaii Five-0 when I suddenly realized that the scene on screen was set in my childhood home. I watched in disbelief as the drug-dealing characters walked out of the house I'd grown up in. They had a shootout in the front yard, and one of the cars even flipped over in the backyard, near where my bedroom window had been. I freaked out and called my mom and brother, telling them what had happened. For years, I told the story to friends and family, but I started to doubt myself after a while. It wasn't until Hawaii Five-0 episodes were available on Netflix many years later that I decided to re-watch the show and see if I had imagined the whole thing. After combing through multiple seasons, I finally found the episode. And sure enough, it had been filmed at my childhood home. Proving it to myself and my family after all those years was incredibly cathartic. Story 33. I was around 5 or 6 when my mom and dad started arguing one day while we were getting ready to return some movies to Blockbuster. Tired of waiting, I decided to load the movies into the car by myself. My dad, noticing what I was doing, ran outside, grabbed me, and dragged me back into the house. I thought he was just being funny, so I didn't put up a fight. My mom then told me to go to my room, but instead I snuck outside to see what was going on. Through the window, I saw my mom lying face down on the floor sobbing while my dad stood over her with his arms crossed. I didn't understand what was happening at the time, and afterward, my mom took me to return the movies like nothing had happened. A month ago, I asked my mom about that day, and she brushed it off, saying it must have been a wild dream, but I know it wasn't. And to this day, I wonder why she won't acknowledge it. Story 34. When I was about 5, my twin brother and I were sleeping on my aunt's porch in sleeping bags. The porch had a sliding glass door that led to the backyard, and I remember having a rough night filled with nightmares. At some point, I woke up and saw a small dog with huge eyes, bathed in a pale blue light, staring at me through the glass door. I was only a foot away from this dog, and it didn't move. Every time I woke up throughout the night, the dog was still there, watching me. It was eerie, but in the morning, it was gone. I told my parents and aunt about it, but they insisted that no one in the neighborhood had a dog like that, and all the gates had been locked. 15 years later, my brother and I were helping my aunt move things out of her house. Out of nowhere, he mentioned how he hated sleeping on that porch as a kid because he would always have nightmares about a cat watching him through the window. It turns out we both saw the same creature that night, but while I saw a dog, he saw a cat. We still don't know what it was, but it left a lasting impression on both of us. Story 35. When I was about 3 years old, I fell down my grandmother's steep stairs and got a black eye. After that, for about 2 years, every time I stood at the top of the stairs, something would lift me up and carry me down to the landing at the bottom, right next to the kitchen. I didn't walk down the stairs, I floated. It happened almost every time we visited my grandmother's house. I remember wishing I could float right into the kitchen so everyone would see me, but I was always set down gently at the bottom of the stairs. One day when I was around 5, I stood at the top of the stairs waiting to be lifted, but nothing happened. I tried to make it happen, but I had to walk down the stairs like everyone else. It never happened again after that. The strange thing is, my great-grandfather, on the other side of the family, had died 6 days before I was born. He fell down the stairs while carrying an air conditioner. I've always wondered if it was him helping me down the stairs all those times. Story 36. When I was a young child, my grandparents gifted me a 3-foot doll named Sally. She was meant to be a cute toy, but to me, she was the source of every single one of my nightmares. Sally had those eerie eyes that would open and close, which made her even creepier, especially at night. Every evening before bed, I would turn her around to face the corner of my room, hoping that would keep her from haunting my dreams. One night, feeling even more scared than usual, I decided to take more drastic measures. I wrapped Sally up like a mummy using my baby blankets and her doll clothes, threw her into a black garbage bag, tied it and taped it shut. Then, I stuffed the bag into the farthest corner of my closet. With my so-called doll prison in place, I finally felt safe enough to go to sleep. But the next morning, I woke up to a horrifying sight. Sally was not only out of the closet, but she was completely unwrapped and sitting in my kiddie chair right next to my bed. I screamed louder than I ever had before, jumped out of bed, and ran out of the room as if my life depended on it. To this day, my parents insist they had nothing to do with it. They hadn't even realized the doll was missing the night before. My younger brother, who was just as terrified of Sally as I was, swore he never touched her either. After that, my brother and I took matters into our own hands. With our parents' blessing, we ripped the Sally doll's limbs off and threw her out with the garbage. Even though Sally was long gone, I still have no explanation for how she managed to escape the closet and end up beside my bed that night. That unsettling mystery has stayed with me ever since. Story 37. When I was about 9 or 10, I used to sleep on the top bunk of a small bunk bed. One night, as I tried to fall asleep, an overwhelming feeling of terror crept in. It came out of nowhere, but being a little kid, I had been scared of the dark before, so I tried to brush it off. There I was lying in bed with my senses on high alert. At the foot of my bed was my bedroom door, which led to a hallway and eventually to my brother's room. Suddenly, I heard slow, sneaky steps coming down the hall, creaking wood, and then silence, as if someone were standing still, waiting. My heart pounded. After gathering enough courage, I quietly called out, "Dad?" The creaking stopped. It sounded like someone shifting weight on the floor. I was petrified. Sitting upright in bed, my eyes locked on the doorway. I called out again, "Dad?" As I did, I saw a faint shadow slowly begin to enter the room. Without thinking, I threw myself under the covers, pressing against the wall as hard as I could, pretending I was invisible. I don't know how long I stayed there, frozen in fear, but eventually, curiosity got the better of me. I cautiously peeked out from under the covers. I saw a figure, but then I noticed something familiar. The figure's clothing had a very small diamond-shaped pattern, and it looked gray. A wave of relief washed over me as I thought, "It's just my dad in his pajamas." Throwing off the covers, I was ready to say, "Dad, I just had a nightmare." But it wasn't my dad. Standing just a few feet away from me was a figure, gray with big black eyes, and its head had 2 lumps protruding from it. The most shocking part was that it looked surprised, not startled, but genuinely surprised that I had revealed myself. That's where my memory ends. I have no idea what happened after that. I didn't wake up scared. I didn't run to my parents, and I slept fine the next night. I've had sleep paralysis before, but I don't think this was related. It could have been a vivid dream or something else, but I'll always wonder what really happened that night. Story 38. From the age of about 8 to 11, I lived in a house with a rundown garage and a rusted kerosene tank in the backyard. Something about that corner of the yard always felt gloomy, and I would often see strange things there. One afternoon, I looked out of my window and saw a huge black canine forelimb clawing at the swing doors of the garage. The doors were padlocked, but the wood was so rotten and the lock had a bit of give, so the limb was able to squeeze through. My first thought was that a dog had somehow been locked inside, so I rushed out to unlock the door, thinking it had gotten trapped. But when I opened the garage, there was nothing there. The windows were locked from the inside, and the garage had no other exits. Judging by the size of the paw, about the size of a Great Dane, there was no way a dog could have hidden in there. Another time, my mom was searching for something in the garage at night and called me out to help. There was no light in there, so we were feeling around in the dark. After a minute or two, I glanced out the window at the far end of the garage and saw the silhouette of a person sitting cross-legged on top of the kerosene tank, waving their arms above their head in a strange, robotic fashion. I shouted to my mom, "There's someone outside waving at us!" She didn't even turn to look. She just yelled at me to stop being silly and rushed us back inside the house. But I'm convinced that whatever I saw that night was not just my imagination. Story 39. When I was younger, I could lucid dream like a pro. I knew when I was dreaming, and I could take full control. One of my favorite tricks was waking myself up from nightmares. I would run away, lie down, close my eyes, count to 3, and then sit up hard and fast. When I opened my eyes, I'd be awake in real life. It worked every time. But one night, it went terribly wrong. I was in the middle of a nightmare, so I decided to use my trusty method. I counted to 3, sat up hard, and opened my eyes. It worked. I was sitting up in bed, wide awake, or so I thought. I decided to go downstairs to get a drink of water, but just as I was walking down the hall, I was stabbed in the chest. Panic flooded me as I realized I hadn't woken up at all. I'd only dreamt that I stopped dreaming. I woke up for real this time, gasping in fear. But now I was unsure if I was still dreaming or actually awake. I've never been caught off guard like that before, and it still haunts me. Story 40. Both of my parents worked at a university that had a child development research department, which also served as a daycare called the Child Labs. Essentially, it was a preschool and kindergarten where parents could send their kids for free or at a reduced cost, and in return, researchers would occasionally observe us, take notes on our behavior, or have us participate in simple experiments. Most of the tests were pretty harmless, like being given a choice between two boxes containing prizes. One box would give you an immediate prize, while the other would require you to wait a few minutes for a better prize. I had no idea this was anything beyond regular school, and to me it seemed normal to have a room with a one-way mirror in the back of the classroom. But one day something strange happened that still sticks with me. I was on the playground and I remember being called inside early, before the other kids. I was led down a hallway to a room I didn't recognize. It wasn't part of our regular classroom. They sat me down and gave me an injection of something. Now I was only 4, so it's possible my memory is playing tricks on me, but I distinctly remember getting that injection. I'd just gotten some new Thomas the Tank Engine toys that day and was really excited to play with them. I remember being happy to go inside early, thinking I'd get more time to play. But instead, they gave me the injection. I told my mom about it later, and she didn't believe me. Years later, when I brought it up again, she still dismissed it. To this day, I don't know if they were actually injecting something or just drawing blood, but it was strange and out of place given the innocent nature of the other experiments they conducted at that daycare. Story 41. I have a vague memory from when I was about 5 years old of being in the storage space of a car with 2 other kids. I think we were on our way to a windmill for a birthday party, but that's about all I can remember. Recently, I asked my parents about it, and they were horrified. They said they would never have allowed something like that to happen, and they can't imagine any parent placing kids in such a dangerous situation. And to be honest, I don't even remember going to an actual party, just being in the car. What's really strange is that not long after this, I started having terrible nightmares. I can't say for sure when it started, but I'm certain it was the same year we moved to a new house. The nightmares were so bad that I became withdrawn and quiet, and I struggled with depression for years. It's only recently that I've started to feel okay again, but something about that car ride has always stuck with me. I don't know if it's just my mind playing tricks on me, or if something bad really happened, but it feels strangely cathartic to finally type this out. Story 42. When I was about 14 or 15, I shared an upstairs room with my sister in our parents' home, and a lot of weird stuff happened in that house. If this story doesn't get buried, enjoy reliving my freaky childhood with me, because I still get goosebumps when I think about it. Sometimes we would hear footsteps creaking on the floor upstairs when everyone was downstairs. All 5 of us heard random male laughter coming from upstairs multiple times during the nearly 10 years we lived there. Occasionally, we'd hear music or muffled conversations. None of it felt malicious at first, though. Something, or someone, would tuck my sister and me into bed almost every night. We'd hear slow, creaking footsteps coming up the stairs, and then the door would slowly open. My covers would always be pulled up to my shoulders, followed by 2 gentle pats on my feet. Then the footsteps would move to my sister's bed, where her covers, which she usually slept under, would be pulled down to her shoulders, and she would get the same gentle pat on her feet. Afterward, the entity would leave the room, closing the door behind it, and head to our mother's bed. She said she would feel an arm wrap around her waist, or the weight of something settling beside her on the mattress. But of course, no one was ever there. Just a rumpled pillow or the blankets pulled back neatly. This happened almost weekly for years. We later found out that an old man had passed away in that house, and it had once been filled with his children and grandchildren. I sometimes wonder if our most cherished moments replay in some sort of cosmic loop after death. It wasn't weird, it was actually comforting. But when my older sister got married and moved out, things turned hostile. The footsteps became loud bangs, and I'd feel something jabbing up at me from under the mattress at night. I started experiencing sleep paralysis regularly, and it was terrifying. One day at 16, I was sitting on my bed watching TV when the banging began. I tried to ignore it, but then the television started jerking forward, just a centimeter at a time. I sat there, frozen, until it became obvious that it was about to crash to the floor. I jumped up to shove it back in place and screamed for my dad to help. He rushed upstairs and found me holding the TV in my arms, babbling about how it had almost flown off the dresser. The final straw was one night when I was alone in the room. My mattress started vibrating, almost undulating beneath me. I jerked upright and yelled, "If something is here, prove it!" In response, my blankets were ripped off my legs and thrown against the wall across the room. I didn't move a muscle until dawn, too terrified to even blink. After that, my mom called a priest to bless the house. It wasn't the last time. Story 43. One night when I was 7, I experienced a creepy and overwhelming sensation that someone was watching me. As I sat in bed, I looked at the photographs of people in the room, and to my horror, it felt like they were all staring at me with worried expressions. It was an intense feeling that something bad was going to happen, almost like my inner thoughts were translating the images in the photographs into a warning. Though I wasn't hearing voices, it was as if my mind was telling me that danger was near. The feeling became so intense that I started screaming for my mother. When she came in, I couldn't explain why I was so terrified, but I cried uncontrollably. Once I calmed down, I explained what had happened and insisted that she take the photos down. Understandably, my mom was freaked out, but managed to calm me down enough for me to fall asleep. The next morning, the Whittier Narrows earthquake hit. We lived not far from the epicenter, and ever since that night, I realized I would get the same eerie feeling of being watched by photographs the day before an earthquake occurred. After moving away from Southern California, I haven't experienced that feeling again. Story 44. When I was around 7, I have a vivid memory of getting off the school bus, walking up my driveway and onto the porch. Strangely, the next thing I remember is being outside on the porch at night, though I have no recollection of entering the house or how much time had passed. I was wearing a black and purple Gothic dress, something I'd never owned or even seen before, and certainly not what I had worn to school that day. For some reason, I accepted the fact that I couldn't go inside the house, and instead, I resigned myself to sleeping on the porch. I curled up on my dog's bed and sat staring out at the woods, terrified of the dark and watching for critters. Growing up in a woodsy area, being outside at night was something I was really scared of, which made the whole experience even more unsettling. At some point, I must have fallen asleep because the next thing I remember is waking up the following morning in my own bed. Confused, I asked my mom what had happened after school, and she told me I had done my normal routine. Ate a corn dog, played with my Barbies, and watched some TV. But none of what she described matched my bizarre and eerie memory of that afternoon and night. Story 45. This story has sparked some heated debates between my mom and me over whether it actually happened. I was around 8 or 9 years old, and my younger sister was about 2 or 3. It was late at night, much later than we'd usually be out, and I remember my mom driving us around. We stopped at a gas station that I still remember being in the same location to this day. My mom handed me a small amount of money, maybe a $5 bill, and told me, "This is all the money we have tonight. I need you to go inside and buy a snack for you and your sister to eat tonight." Even back then, I thought it was strange because while we weren't wealthy, it seemed odd that we'd only have $5 for food. So I went inside the gas station, wandering around the aisles trying to figure out the best thing to buy. In my 8-year-old mind, I decided the best use of the $5 was 2 packs of Batman trading cards. I was so excited that I rushed back to the car, proudly holding my purchase. Naturally, my mom was furious. She yelled at me for being selfish, telling me that because I'd spent the money on trading cards, my sister wouldn't have anything to eat that night. I felt so ashamed. I started sobbing and pulled out the awful dry gum that came with the cards, telling my mom that my sister could have all of it. Then something unexpected happened. My mom started crying too. We both sat there in the car, sobbing together for about 5 minutes before she calmed down, and we drove home in silence. For years, no one brought up that night. When I was in my mid-20s, I finally asked my mom about it, wondering what had actually happened. To my surprise, she had no recollection of the event and swore she would never have done something like that. But for me, it remains one of the most vivid memories of my childhood, even if she insists it never happened. Story 46. This story isn't actually my memory, but rather one my mom tells me about my childhood. It's one of those eerie things that always sticks with you. My mom says that when I was about 3 years old, she woke up in the middle of the night and saw a little boy standing in the doorway. He looked just like me, same age and everything, but he was wearing strange clothes. The boy didn't say anything, but he pointed out of her room in the direction of mine and my brother's room. After that, My mom heard crying coming from our room, so she rushed past the boy and found me sound asleep in bed. But my younger brother wasn't. He had a fever of 104, and they had to rush him to the hospital that night. What makes this even stranger is that my aunt says she saw the same boy that night in her own home, though I forget exactly what happened at her place. The story came full circle last year. Some friends and I went to explore an abandoned mental asylum, just for the thrill of it. We all wore doctor's masks and sweatpants to protect ourselves from the dust and debris inside. We took some pictures while we were there and didn't think much of it at the time. But later, when we looked through the photos, we noticed something odd. In one of the pictures, there's a figure that looks like a little boy about the same age I would have been when my mom saw that boy in our house. He's not wearing a mask or the same kind of clothing as us, but he's clearly visible in the background. I'm not really superstitious, but I can't help but wonder if there's something or someone looking out for me and my family. Maybe I was supposed to be a twin, and he didn't survive but somehow watches over us. It's a creepy thought, but I can't shake the feeling there might be something more to it. Story 47. When I was around 4 years old, I lived in a small 2-bedroom basement apartment with my mom and 2 sisters. They shared a room, and my mom had the other one, so I always slept on the couch in the living room. One night, while I was lying on the couch, I heard a scream coming from my sister's room down the hall. I was covered with a blanket, and I remember pulling it down just enough to look towards the hallway. What I saw made my blood run cold. A gray figure was slowly hovering just inches above the floor, coming out of the hallway towards the living room where I was. The figure was very dark gray, with no facial features except for empty eye sockets, and it had a faint, lighter gray aura about 3 inches wide surrounding its form. It also had what looked like ropes or chains around its neck dangling just above the floor as it moved. I was completely paralyzed with fear. The figure kept moving towards me, and there was nothing I could do but watch as it got closer and closer. When it was about 5 feet away from me, I finally pulled the blanket over my head and stayed that way for about 10 seconds. When I finally peeked out again, the gray figure was inches from my face, its empty eye sockets staring right at me. At that moment, it let out the most horrifying, blood-curdling noise I had ever heard. The sound was so terrifying that I immediately passed out. I woke up the next morning with no clear memory of what had happened, but I never forgot the gray figure. Story 48. From a very young age, around 5 or 6, I would often wake up in the middle of the night to see a dark figure in my room. He always wore a cowboy hat and a long trench coat, and I assumed he was a man. He would just stand there, silently watching me. Every time I'd wake up, he'd still be there, as if nothing had changed. I'd eventually fall back asleep, only to see him again in later nights. Around the same time, I began having recurring dreams about my oldest sister, who passed away at just 2 months old, long before I was born. In my dreams, my sister was about 6 years old, which my mother later told me was the age she would have been when I was born. In the dreams, we would walk through the cemetery where she is buried. She never grew older, but I always did. Every time we walked, she would talk to me about whatever was troubling me in life at the time, offering comfort. When I finally spoke to my parents about the dreams, my father told me something similar had happened to him. He said his grandfather would visit him in his dreams, and they would walk through the halls of a business my family owned, discussing whatever weighed on my dad's mind. He suggested that the dark figure I kept seeing might have been his grandfather, my great-grandfather, watching over me. As for my dreams about my sister, both my mom and dad confirmed that my descriptions of her and the cemetery were accurate. When I visited her grave for the first time at 19, I walked straight to her headstone, as if I'd known exactly where she was buried, despite never being there before. To this day, I still dream about my sister, and I occasionally see the dark figure of my great-grandfather. In recent years, after my father and grandmother passed away, I've started seeing them in my dreams as well. I don't claim to speak to the dead, and I don't expect others to believe in ghosts. But these dreams and visions have been a source of comfort, especially during some of the hardest times in my life.